The night was warm, and the city lights shimmered like scattered diamonds. Reflecting off the sleek glass of the hotel where the gala was being held, inside the ballroom was a scene of opulence and wealth, filled with the chatter of powerful executives. The clinking of glasses and the soft hum of a live jazz band, the smell of expensive perfume mixed with the aroma of fine food. Creating an atmosphere that was both intoxicating and intimidating, she entered quietly, her posture calm but confident. Dressed in a simple yet elegant outfit that didn't scream for attention but demanded it in its own quiet way. As she walked through the crowd, she noticed the eyes of many turning briefly toward her, some curious, others dismissive. She had attended countless corporate events before, but tonight felt different. She wasn't just another face in the crowd. She carried with her the responsibility of an $800 million deal that could change the course of her company. And she knew every second mattered, at the luxury table where the key decision-makers were gathered. She saw the faces of the men who would determine the fate of the deal. They were well-dressed, confident, and undeniably influential. But there was an air of arrogance about them, a sense that they believed nothing coming from her could be worth their attention. She quietly took her seat, offering a polite nod to those around her, but received little acknowledgement in return. The men continued their conversation, speaking over each other and laughing at jokes that were crude and unnecessary. As the conversation flowed, it became painfully clear that she was being underestimated. One executive waved dismissively at her, making a comment about how rare it was to see a woman in a room like this. And another chuckled, implying that she might not fully understand the complexities of the deal. She felt the sting of mockery, but instead of responding with anger, she observed. She noted their body language, the overconfidence in their voices, and the subtle ways they tried to dominate the discussion. Every smirk, every glance, every laugh gave her insight into their weaknesses. She sipped her water slowly, pretending to be absorbed in her own thoughts, while in reality, she was calculating her strategy. The room was filled with noise, with people vying for attention, but she found a strange sense of calm amidst the chaos. She reminded herself that she had faced tougher challenges, that she had closed deals worth millions before, and that this was simply another test of her patience and intelligence. One man leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of wine and looking at her with a smirk. "Are you really sure you're ready for this?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Laughter erupted around the table. Others added their own comments, joking about how she might need someone to hold her hand through the negotiation. She felt a momentary flash of irritation, but she pushed it aside. She knew reacting emotionally would only give them power over her. Instead, she listened carefully, letting their words reveal their true selves. As she sat there, she began to mentally outline her plan. She would let them continue underestimating her for now. Their arrogance was a tool she could use. Each incorrect assumption they made was an opportunity for her to gain the upper hand. She noted the points where their knowledge was weak, where they relied too heavily on outdated information, and where their pride might cloud their judgment. She knew that once she spoke, there would be no room for doubt or dismissal. The conversation shifted to the details of the deal. Numbers were thrown around casually, as if everyone at the table fully understood the implications. But she noticed the gaps in their calculations immediately. They were speaking from memory and assumptions rather than facts. Her mind raced, correcting the figures, anticipating objections, and preparing counterpoints that would leave no room for argument. She realized that this wasn't just a negotiation. It was a test of perception, wit, and control. Throughout the evening, servers moved gracefully around the table, offering champagne and canapes, and the atmosphere remained one of casual extravagance. The men at the table continued their banter, oblivious to the sharp observations she was making. She watched one executive boast about a previous deal, exaggerating his role and dismissing the contributions of others. Another tried to assert dominance by interrupting and correcting minor details, hoping to intimidate those around him. She noted each move, each tactic, recognizing the patterns and planning how she could turn them against themselves, even though she was being ignored. She felt a growing sense of anticipation. She understood that the quiet observation phase was crucial. By remaining calm and composed, she was allowing their overconfidence to build, setting the stage for the moment when she would assert her authority. She reminded herself that knowledge was power, and she had an abundance of it. The more they underestimated her, the more effective her eventual revelation would be. The room continued to pulse with energy, laughter, and conversation, but she remained focused. She wasn't there to participate in empty chatter or social games. She was there to secure the deal, to protect her company, and to demonstrate that competence and intelligence were not defined by gender or by status at a table. She observed how the executives handled small disagreements, how they reacted to challenges, and how they revealed their priorities through subtle cues. Every detail mattered. As the night progressed, the conversation turned to projections and future plans. The men discussed expansion, market trends, and potential risks, each trying to impress the others with their insight. She noticed that many of their assumptions were flawed, based on incomplete information or outdated data. She made careful mental notes, preparing the points she would raise when the moment was right. She knew that precision and timing would be everything. Even in the midst of mockery, she maintained her composure. She smiled politely when necessary, nodded at points that required acknowledgement, and allowed the conversation to flow without interruption. But beneath her calm exterior, her mind was working tirelessly, mapping out the exact sequence of statements and revelations that would change the room forever. By the end of the evening, she felt a quiet confidence. She had gathered all the information she needed, observed every nuance, and identified the key players and their vulnerabilities. The men at the table still saw her as an outsider, someone who might provide minor input, but not someone who could control the outcome. This perception was exactly what she needed. She would use it to her advantage. As the gala continued, the room buzzing with music, laughter, and conversation, she sipped her drink and allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. She was ready. In the next part of the evening, she would begin to shift the balance of power. The mocking and dismissive behavior she endured had only prepared her for the moment. When she would step forward and take control, she knew that patience, observation, and quiet confidence were the keys to turning this situation into a triumph. And she was ready for it. The laughter at the table grew louder, echoing through the high-ceilinged ballroom, as if the walls themselves were joining in. She sat quietly, sipping her drink, feeling the weight of every mocking glance and offhand comment. One executive leaned in, smirking, said something about her being new to such high-stakes negotiations, his tone heavy with condescension. The others laughed, nodding along as though they were sharing a private joke at her expense. Instead of reacting, she simply nodded politely, her eyes scanning the table. Noticing who led the conversations, who stayed silent, and who seemed uncertain, yet tried to mask it. Every detail mattered. She observed their gestures, the flickers of doubt that surfaced when they spoke too fast, or the subtle hesitation when they assumed she would not notice their mistakes. She could see through their arrogance, their need to appear dominant. It was as if their mockery had given her a clear map of their weaknesses. The man who had first made the comment continued. Leaning back in his chair with a self-satisfied smile, he began recounting a previous deal he had closed, exaggerating the details and taking credit for others' work. Another executive chimed in, making a sarcastic remark about her understanding of market trends, suggesting that she might not be familiar with the scope of an $800 million project. The air was thick with dismissiveness, but she felt a quiet satisfaction. They were revealing themselves. Every word they spoke was a tool she could use. She let the conversation flow, giving them the illusion that she was listening but not contributing. Inside, her mind was a whirlwind of calculations and strategies. She thought about the key points of the deal, the numbers that mattered, the risks, and the opportunities. She noted every exaggeration, every misstatement, and mentally corrected them, preparing for the moment when she would step in, show that she was the one in control. The table was a mix of personalities. One executive was aggressive, trying to assert dominance with sharp comments and interruptions. Another relied on charm, smiling and laughing, trying to disarm anyone who questioned him. A third seemed thoughtful but hesitant, nodding along to the stronger voices, but occasionally showing a flicker of doubt. She understood these dynamics immediately. She didn't need to speak yet. Observation was her weapon, and patience was her ally. As the conversation moved to projections, one man began to outline their assumptions about market growth, revenue, and investment risks. He spoke with confidence, but she could see the cracks. He was relying on outdated data, ignoring recent trends that could affect the outcome of the deal. She made a mental note to address these points, knowing that when she spoke, her clarity and accuracy would make him look reckless and uninformed. A server passed by with a tray of hors d'oeuvres, and she picked a small bite, savoring the simple act of calm amidst the chaos. The others continued, oblivious to the fact that she was gathering ammunition for the moment she would take control. She realized that their confidence was their greatest weakness. They were so sure of themselves that they didn't consider that someone at the table could challenge them effectively. The mocking comments continued, and one of the executives leaned back with a laugh, saying something about how amusing it was to see her trying to keep up. She felt a twinge of irritation, but suppressed it. Anger would be a distraction. She had learned long ago that calmness in the face of ridicule was far more powerful than confrontation. She observed each gesture, each glance, and even the pauses in their speech. Every small detail would become part of the story. She would tell to reveal the truth of the situation. She noticed subtle alliances forming among the men. One seemed to support the more aggressive comments, while another tried to moderate, perhaps sensing that the ridicule might go too far. These dynamics were important. Understanding who influenced the conversation and who followed quietly would help her later when she needed to assert her points. She was mapping the room mentally, preparing for the moment when her voice would shift the balance. Time seemed to stretch as the laughter and chatter continued. Each mockery, each underestimation, was another piece of the puzzle falling into place. She knew the executives believed they had the upper hand, that she was an outsider who could be ignored. But she also knew that once she spoke, the game would change completely. They were building the tension for her, knowingly creating the perfect conditions for her to demonstrate her authority. The discussion turned to risk assessment. The men shared their predictions with confidence, dismissing recent market shifts and ignoring certain warning signs. She noted their mistakes silently. Each incorrect assumption, each overlooked factor, was a point she could highlight when she intervened. She wasn't just observing their arrogance. She was preparing to correct it, to guide the conversation with facts that could not be disputed. One executive made a sarcastic remark about her ability to handle negotiations, implying that a woman would not have the experience or temperament to manage such a massive deal. The others laughed again, reinforcing the stereotype. She felt the familiar pang of injustice, but she did not let it surface. Instead, she reminded herself that their ignorance was temporary and that knowledge would always outshine prejudice. She smiled faintly to herself, knowing that the moment was coming when all their assumptions would be proven wrong. As the evening progressed, the tone of the table remained dismissive but predictable. She watched as the men tried to assert dominance through interruption, boasting, and mockery. They had not realized that her silence was strategic, that she was observing, calculating, and preparing to shift the conversation entirely in her favor. Her composure was deliberate, her patience a silent statement of power. She reflected on her own experiences in similar high-pressure situations. She had faced doubt, mockery, and underestimation countless times. Each time, she had learned that the best response was not confrontation but preparation. Knowledge, clarity, and timing were far more effective than anger or defensiveness. She drew on those lessons now, feeling a sense of readiness. The challenge was immense, but she was prepared. The men continued their discussion, unaware of the storm brewing beneath her calm exterior. She saw the inconsistencies in their logic, the overconfidence in their numbers, and the gaps in their understanding. Every flaw they revealed was an opportunity. When she spoke, she would not just participate. She would redirect, correct, and assert control. She would make it clear that the deal would proceed on terms that made sense, and anyone who doubted her judgment would be left, questioning their own competence. As the conversation wound down to smaller details, she felt a quiet excitement. The moment was near. Their mockery, their underestimation, had done its work. They had provided her with the information, the errors, and the psychological advantage she needed. She had observed, analyzed, and planned. Now, all that remained was to act. The room continued to pulse with energy, laughter, and chatter. She sipped her drink, listening to the last few mocking remarks, letting them fade into background noise. She knew that soon, the balance of power at the table would shift completely. The men believed they were in control, but she was ready to change that perception. She had the knowledge, the clarity, and the confidence to turn the situation around in minutes. And she would. The room fell into a hum of chatter as she straightened slightly in her seat, feeling a subtle shift in her own energy. She had observed, calculated, and now it was time to act. The men around the table had built a false sense of superiority, laughing and joking as though the deal was theirs to control. They had no idea that every word, every joke, and every careless assumption they had made had only strengthened her position. She began speaking softly at first, not to draw attention, but to make her points precise and undeniable. The first statement she made was a correction of a minor detail in their projections, presented calmly and matter-of-factly. Heads turned slightly, some in mild surprise, others in irritation. The man who had mocked her earlier raised an eyebrow, trying to regain control by dismissing her comment, but she continued unfazed, adding supporting facts and numbers that clearly exposed the errors in his assumptions. The laughter that had filled the room moments before began to fade. The executives looked at one another, sensing that the dynamic was shifting, though they were unsure why. She spoke with clarity, each word deliberate, pointing out risks they had overlooked, data they had ignored, and the financial consequences of their miscalculations. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calm authority contrasted sharply with their earlier overconfidence, making them suddenly aware of the seriousness of the situation. One executive tried to interrupt, attempting to reassert dominance, but she anticipated it. She allowed him a moment, nodded politely, and then continued with a point that directly contradicted his assertion, using concrete examples and current market data. The room went quiet. Even those who had been mocking her now leaned in, trying to understand the corrections she was presenting. Every small smirk and dismissive glance had disappeared. She had their attention, and it was complete. As she moved through the details of the deal, she carefully highlighted the areas where their plan could fail, the hidden risks that had been overlooked, and the opportunities they had ignored. She presented alternative solutions with a calm certainty that left no room for argument. Each point she made was precise, backed by evidence, and impossible to refute. The men at the table shifted uncomfortably. Realizing that their assumptions and jokes had been premature, her strategy was not just to correct them, but to demonstrate that she had a vision that encompassed the entire deal from every angle. She showed that she understood the nuances, the subtleties, and the financial implications in ways they had not considered. By the time she finished the first segment of her presentation, the room was silent. She had transformed from the mocked outsider into the central authority in the conversation. The man who had been most vocal in his ridicule attempted a weak counterpoint, trying to salvage his position. She acknowledged it briefly, then methodically dismantled his argument with clear reasoning, data, and examples that highlighted the flaws in his logic. Each correction was delivered without aggression, but with such clarity and precision that resistance seemed futile. The table was quiet except for her voice, and all eyes were on her. She paused briefly to gauge reactions. Some executives looked shocked, their earlier confidence shaken. Others nodded subtly, recognizing the truth of her statements. Even those who had tried to dominate the discussion were now listening carefully, aware that any further dismissal could expose their ignorance. She had changed the energy in the room completely, from one of arrogance and mockery to one of cautious attention. She then moved to the critical financial points, highlighting projections, risks, and opportunities in a way that made the stakes clear. Her knowledge was thorough, her understanding deep, and her presentation structured. She didn't just criticize, she guided the conversation, showing the path forward that would benefit everyone, while making it clear that her leadership was indispensable to achieving the desired outcome. The executives began to ask questions, tentatively at first, then with increasing seriousness. She answered each one with patience and clarity, never condescending, but never allowing her authority to be challenged. She had created an environment where they could no longer rely on ego or charm to dominate. Facts, insight, and clarity now ruled the table. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with their flustered attempts to regain control. Emphasizing her growing dominance in the conversation, she noticed subtle changes in the room's dynamics. One of the more aggressive executives, who had been most vocal in his ridicule, now seemed uncertain. Choosing to remain silent rather than risk further mistakes, another executive, who had been quietly observing, leaned forward slightly, showing engagement and interest in her analysis. She had not only captured their attention, but had begun to influence their thinking, guiding them to see the deal through her lens as she moved to the final part of her initial presentation. She outlined a series of steps and conditions that needed to be met for the deal to proceed successfully. Her recommendations were logical, precise, and rooted in undeniable facts. She presented them in a calm, steady voice, making it clear that these were not suggestions open to debate, but necessary actions to ensure the success of the $800 million deal. The men at the table were listening intently, their earlier mockery replaced by quiet contemplation. She watched the reactions carefully, noting the shifts in posture, the subtle nods, and the expressions of realization. The executives were now beginning to understand that they had misjudged her completely. Her calm authority, precision, and knowledge had left them no choice but to acknowledge her expertise. The room, once filled with laughter and dismissal, had transformed into a space of focused attention and quiet respect. Even as she concluded this part of her presentation, she maintained her composure, never appearing triumphant or aggressive. Her strategy was not to embarrass them, but to demonstrate competence, clarity, and leadership. She knew that true influence was gained through knowledge and precision, not confrontation or dominance. By remaining composed, she reinforced her authority, making it impossible for anyone to dismiss her contributions. She allowed a moment of silence after presenting her points, giving the executives time to absorb the information. Some shifted in their seats, reflecting on the implications, while others exchanged glances, clearly recalculating their previous assumptions. She had created a subtle but unmistakable power shift. The mocked outsider had become the voice of authority, the center of the discussion, and the person who now dictated the direction of the negotiation. The conversation slowly resumed. But this time, it was different. The executives asked questions with genuine curiosity, seeking her guidance rather than trying to challenge her. Her responses were measured, insightful, and decisive, further reinforcing the control she now held. She noticed that the initial tension in the room had given way to a more respectful and attentive atmosphere, where ideas were considered carefully rather than dismissed out of hand. As the meeting progressed, she continued to build on her points, each one reinforcing the previous. She highlighted overlooked opportunities, potential risks, and strategic advantages that had been ignored in earlier discussions. Her analysis was comprehensive, her reasoning sound, and her confidence unwavering. The executives were now fully engaged, their earlier arrogance replaced by recognition of her expertise. By the end of the segment, it was clear that she had shifted the entire dynamic. The room that had once mocked and ignored her now hung on her every word, acknowledging her authority without anyone needing to say it aloud. She had taken control of the conversation, guided the discussion with precision, and demonstrated beyond any doubt that she was the driving force behind the success of the $800 million deal. She leaned back slightly in her chair, allowing herself a brief moment of quiet satisfaction. The first stage of her plan had succeeded. The mockery had faded, the underestimation had been corrected, and her authority had been established. She was ready for the next phase, where she would consolidate her influence and guide the conversation toward the final terms of the deal. The room had transformed completely, and she was at the center of that transformation. Calm, confident, and in complete control. The atmosphere at the table had changed completely. Where there had been laughter, mockery, and casual arrogance, there was now a tense focus. Every eye was on her, and every movement she made carried weight. The executives had realized, in a matter of minutes, their previous assumptions were flawed, and the woman they had ignored was now the central force in the discussion. She felt the shift subtly, like the room itself, acknowledging her presence and authority. She began the next part of her presentation calmly, outlining the steps necessary to protect the deal from risk and maximize profit. Her voice was steady, precise, and measured, leaving no room for doubt. She presented alternative approaches and contingency plans, each backed with data, calculations, and strategic reasoning. She did not rush. She knew that confidence came from control and clarity, and she used both to command attention without ever raising her voice. One executive, who had earlier mocked her with a sarcastic smile, tried to interject with a question, attempting to regain control. She allowed him a brief moment, nodding politely, then continued seamlessly, incorporating his question into her explanation. In doing so, she demonstrated both her knowledge and her ability to manage the conversation, turning what could have been a challenge into a reinforcement of her authority. The man sat back, his smirk fading. As he realized she could handle challenges without faltering, she moved through the critical points of the deal, highlighting errors in their previous planning and offering corrections in a way that was impossible to dispute. Her clarity exposed the gaps in their thinking and forced them to confront facts they had overlooked. She spoke about timelines, resource allocations, risk assessments, and profit margins, making sure every detail was accounted for. She did not belabor points unnecessarily, but every statement she made carried impact, demonstrating mastery of both the details and the bigger picture. The executives listened, some leaning forward slightly, others exchanging glances of surprise or concern. They were beginning to see that the negotiation was no longer about ego or appearances. It was about competence and understanding. She had turned the table entirely, shifting the focus from their arrogance to the undeniable reality of her expertise. She had become the pivot around which the entire deal now revolved. She paused for a moment, allowing the weight of her analysis to settle in. There was a brief silence, broken only by the soft hum of the ballroom and the quiet shuffle of papers. Then she continued, moving into the next critical phase, outlining the terms and conditions under which the deal could proceed. Her recommendations were clear and direct, leaving no ambiguity. She emphasized that these terms were not optional but necessary for success. She spoke calmly, her tone firm, and every word carried authority. One executive tried to argue against a point, attempting to reassert influence. She listened carefully, nodding to acknowledge his concern, then countered with precise logic and data. She did not attack him personally, but dismantled the argument itself, highlighting the risks and consequences of ignoring her advice. The room went silent once more, the earlier atmosphere of casual dominance completely replaced by focused attention. She had become the voice of reason and authority, and there was no question that her guidance would shape the outcome of the deal. The conversation began to shift. Where the executives had once been, the ones speaking confidently and dismissing her, they were now asking for her insights, seeking clarification, and validating her proposals. She answered each query with calm patience, never appearing rushed or flustered. Each response reinforced her control, making it clear that she had a comprehensive understanding of the deal that surpassed all others at the table. Her calm confidence contrasted sharply with their earlier overconfidence, and the difference was impossible to ignore. As she detailed the potential outcomes and scenarios, she highlighted how the previous assumptions would have led to significant financial loss. She presented alternative strategies that not only corrected these errors, but also increased profit margins and minimized risk. Each recommendation was backed by facts, numbers, and logical reasoning, making it impossible for anyone to dismiss her points. The executives were now fully engaged, their earlier mockery replaced by serious consideration. She could sense the subtle shift in the balance of power. The men who had been most vocal in their ridicule were now cautious, measuring every word before speaking. Others who had been silent observers were now leaning in, actively participating, but guided by her insights rather than their own assumptions. She had transformed the energy at the table from one of dominance and mockery to one of respect and attentiveness. Without ever needing to assert aggression, the moment of climax came when she addressed the most critical component of the deal, the terms that would determine whether it succeeded or failed. She outlined the necessary adjustments using clear reasoning and precise calculations. She explained the consequences of ignoring her advice and the benefits of following her recommendations. The room was silent, every person absorbing the implications of her words. She had created a moment where there was no room for debate. Her authority was absolute. The executive who had led the mocking earlier sat back, visibly shaken by the clarity and precision of her analysis. He exchanged glances with the others, recognizing that their earlier underestimation had been a mistake. She had not only corrected errors, but had also presented a vision of the deal that was coherent, profitable, and strategically sound. The laughter, smirks, and dismissive gestures were gone. In their place was a quiet acknowledgement that she now controlled the negotiation. She continued to guide the discussion, allowing the executives to ask questions, but always directing the conversation back to her framework. She demonstrated that she had considered every scenario, anticipated every objection, and prepared solutions for potential challenges. Her control was subtle, but unmistakable. She had not needed to raise her voice or dominate aggressively. Her knowledge and composure had done all the work. The executives began to nod in agreement, some taking notes, others quietly reconsidering their positions. They were no longer questioning her authority. They were accepting it. She had effectively turned the table, transforming a situation where she had been mocked and ignored into one where she led the conversation with precision and control. Every point she made reinforced her position and highlighted the flaws in their earlier assumptions. As she moved toward the final stage of the discussion, she outlined a series of actionable steps to finalize the deal. Each step was logical, practical, and based on her thorough understanding of the situation. The executives listened intently, now fully engaged and reliant on her expertise. The atmosphere was one of focus and respect, stark contrast to the casual arrogance and mockery from earlier in the evening. She had achieved a complete transformation in the dynamics at the table. She concluded her presentation with a calm summary, reiterating the key points and necessary actions. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her authority and the clarity of her analysis settling over everyone. The executives recognized that their earlier dismissal had been a mistake, and her influence was now unquestionable. She had turned what could have been a humiliating evening into a demonstration of skill, intelligence, and strategic mastery as she leaned back slightly. Allowing the implications of her words to resonate, she felt a quiet satisfaction. The mockery and underestimation had been replaced by attention, respect, and acknowledgement of her authority. She had guided the conversation, corrected mistakes, and demonstrated the value of her expertise, all while maintaining composure and calmness. The room had been transformed, and she was at the center of that transformation, fully in control, ready to finalize the deal on her terms. The final moments of the meeting were quiet but charged with an energy that had replaced the earlier chaos. The executives at the table, once dismissive and mocking, now listened attentively to every word. She had not only corrected the errors in their assumptions, but had also guided the discussion toward a framework that ensured the success of the $800 million deal. The atmosphere had shifted completely, and the respect she had earned was evident in every glance, every pause, every subtle gesture. She reviewed the main points of the negotiation one last time, summarizing the conditions, risks, and opportunities. Her voice was calm but firm, and each statement carried clarity that left no room for doubt. The executives nodded, recognizing that the deal could only succeed under the terms she outlined. There was no need for confrontation or aggressive assertion. Her authority had been established through knowledge, precision, and composure. One of the executives, who had been particularly vocal in mocking her earlier, leaned forward and spoke in a tone that was almost hesitant. He admitted that he had underestimated her and acknowledged the strength of her analysis. She nodded politely, offering a brief smile, understanding that acknowledgement was important, but that the focus remained on the work, not personal validation. She had achieved what mattered. The deal was secure, and her expertise was recognized. The discussion turned to the final terms of the deal. She guided the executives through each step, explaining the rationale behind her recommendations and the benefits they would bring. The room remained quiet, filled with concentration and careful attention. She had transformed the dynamic from a room of arrogance and mockery into a collaborative space where her insight shaped every decision. Her influence was undeniable, yet it was subtle. It's built on facts and logic rather than force or dominance. She observed the reactions of each executive. Some were impressed, clearly reconsidering their previous judgments. Others appeared reflective, realizing that the mockery they had engaged in had been misplaced. She had demonstrated not only competence but also the ability to lead a complex negotiation with clarity and precision. The respect she earned was evident in their body language and the way they engaged with her proposals. She had turned underestimation into recognition, without needing to assert ego or aggression. As the meeting moved to the conclusion, she outlined the steps for implementation and follow-up. Her plan was thorough, leaving no detail overlooked. She provided a clear roadmap for execution, ensuring that the deal would proceed smoothly and effectively. The executives listened attentively, asking questions that she answered with patience and precision. She had created an environment where her guidance was both necessary and respected. Solidifying her role as the leader in this negotiation, she reflected briefly on the journey that had brought her here. The initial mockery, the dismissive comments, and the subtle attempts to undermine her authority had all been obstacles. But they had also provided her with the opportunity to demonstrate her skill and intelligence. She had remained calm, observed carefully, and strategically chosen the moment to assert her expertise. The result was not only the successful handling of the $800 million deal, but also a profound shift in perception. She had turned doubt into respect and mockery into acknowledgement. The executives began to take notes and discuss among themselves, guided by her framework. She observed silently, allowing them to engage while maintaining control of the overall direction. Her calm demeanor continued to set the tone, demonstrating that leadership was not about dominating conversation but about guiding it with clarity and insight. The mockery that had once filled the room was completely absent, replaced by thoughtful engagement and careful consideration as the final agreements were confirmed. She felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The deal had been secured on terms that were beneficial and strategically sound. The executives, who had once dismissed her, now recognized her as a central figure in the negotiation. Her calm authority, precision, and insight had transformed the evening from a challenging situation into a clear victory. She had not only achieved the desired outcome, but had also earned respect and acknowledgement that would last far beyond this meeting. She allowed herself a brief moment to breathe. Noting the subtle glances and nods from the executives that indicated acknowledgement, she had turned a potentially humiliating situation into a demonstration of skill and strategic mastery. Every point she had made, every correction she had provided, and every step she had guided had contributed to the successful conclusion. The $800 million deal was not just a financial achievement. It was a testament to her leadership, composure, and intelligence. As the meeting ended, the executives began to leave, offering polite acknowledgments and quiet compliments. She remained seated for a moment, reflecting on how she had transformed the dynamics of the room. The mocking and dismissive behavior that had greeted her upon arrival had been completely replaced by respect and recognition. She had turned observation, patience, and strategic action into authority and influence, demonstrating that competence and clarity could overcome prejudice and underestimation. She gathered her notes and rose from the table, feeling a sense of accomplishment that was quiet but deeply satisfying. The gala continued around her, filled with laughter and conversation, but she moved through it with calm assurance. Knowing that the outcome of the deal and the respect she had earned would resonate far beyond this evening, She had proven that skill, composure, strategic thinking could turn even the most challenging situations into triumphs. As she left the room, she felt a quiet pride. The executives would remember this evening not for their own performance, but for her clarity, precision, and authority. She had taken control without arrogance, guided the conversation without aggression, and secured an $800 million deal that would have far-reaching impact. The journey from mockery to acknowledgement had been complete, and she had emerged not only victorious, but respected. Her intelligence and leadership unmistakable to all who had witnessed the transformation.